Welcome, folks. My name is David Cobb. I am the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. I am so very grateful for you joining us and really excited to have the great privilege of being an interlocutor on this conversation. This conversation is framed as reflections on the 2021 Democratic Socialists of America National Convention. But really, y'all, it's much deeper than that, because I think that what we're hoping to do is actually have a hard, comradely, strategic conversation on rising fascism, the role of Democratic Socialists of America, but also the movement generally, and what this moment entails. Again, I'll be basically the interlocutor through the conversation. I'm going to very quickly just introduce the folks who were on the panel, give you a sense of the arc. We have Kristian Hernandez and David Duhalde, who are both leaders of Democratic Socialists of America on the National Political Committee. We have Bill Fletcher, well-known author, trade unionist, and revolutionary theorist. And we have Matt Nelson with Presente.org. Each one of these folks have very long bios that I could spend time on, but I'm not going to do that, because I really want to actually get into the substance of the discourse. And just so that you have a roadmap for what we're going to do, I hope that my comrade Melissa Figueroa is going to join us. If so, she and I together will both ask some level-setting questions about what happened at the DSA convention. Kristian and David will really be the main folks there, but I'll encourage Bill and Matt to participate there to give us that level of clarity, right? So that we know the terrain intellectually before we begin to travel it. The next big piece is Bill Fletcher has written a very provocative piece on Tecumseh in Monthly Review. It's specifically titled The Modern Tecumseh and the Future of the US Left. It came out, I think, just last month. It's gotten a lot of attention, and we want to turn to that. Then I'm going to specifically, Matt, bring you in and ask some questions around Presente.org, but also, again, like I know you for a long time, right? Like several decades now. And I'm going to be asking you not just about Presente.org, but also about like what you're hearing and what you're thinking. So sort of bring you in at that point. And then I want to make sure that we have some conversation around opportunities for collaboration, especially as it relates to national and state policy around the building of a cooperative solidarity economy movement. And I know Mel was hoping to get into some relational versus transactional organizing. So that's the arc of how we're going to discuss it. I will encourage you during the first part of this, if you've got comments or questions that are very specific, please utilize the chat. Folks at Shelter and Solidarity will feed those in. They'll read them out loud to allow our panelists to respond. And we will, as always on Shelter and Solidarity, try to end with very open conversation. So with that, I'm going to actually turn to Kristian and David to help us understand, so what happened at the DSA convention, and especially for those like me who are sort of following the caucuses, sort of like there's some very clear currents, right? And it looks to me like those caucuses definitely represent specific positionality within DSA. And I'm going to ask you to the best of your ability, I believe that y'all are already also active in currents yourself, but just give us the lay of the land. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kristian and David.
Why don't you go first?
All right, I can go first. Hello, everyone. I'm Kristian. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in North Texas, and I am a re-elected member of the National Political Committee, which is the highest leadership body in DSA in between conventions. And in particular with the convention, I did have the honor and perhaps punishment a little bit of serving as one of the convention co-chairs. So really was able to see from the very beginning. It was a very long 10-month process of putting this together. And very early on, the NPC did have to make the decision to hold this virtually, which obviously I think is something that cannot be understated as to the importance about it being a virtual convention. From what I hear, it went a lot better than most other formations, including the Republican Party, who have tried to hold virtual conventions of any sort, which is great. You know, this was our largest convention to date with over 1,300 delegates. And so to have it be both the largest and the first virtual one was an endeavor in and of itself. But it did have, you know, its merits of more people were able to participate since there wasn't as much, obviously, travel involved. And I think also one of the downsides was not really being able to have that in-person interaction that is often necessary to counter, you know, just bad faith interpretations, and also, you know, not being able to build that camaraderie in person. So that's definitely played a big part in how things unfolded, but I think ultimately it did allow us to have a more robust program, to have more opportunities for debate, and to bring on a whole slew of really amazing speakers and panelists to really speak to some of the things that are resonating and important within the DSA membership. And in particular, at a moment where, you know, I don't even want to say post-pandemic, post the first wave of this pandemic, we had an influx of over 35,000 members, a lot of people who have never really been in any sort of political organization are finding a political home for the first time. And I think a lot of what played out at the convention was really honing in on this, what does it mean to be a socialist organizer? DSA members get a little card that says socialist organizer, and really defining both what that means and the roles that we play in, you know, in the struggle for a better world, I think was really somewhat of the undercurrent of a lot of the resolutions that were put forward. But we also saw a lot of consensus, a lot of collaboration, and I think that began with being very intentional from the very beginning of making sure that people knew what the purpose of the convention was, not just a matter of, hey, you know, these people won, these people lost. I know everyone takes their wins and goes home, and we do it again in another 2 years. But really, the convention steering committee had a lot of really intentional conversations about making sure that our convention was really a place where we could talk about strategy, where we could talk about what things, you know, DSA wanted to prioritize, and in particular, where our role was in the larger, you know, movement against capitalism. And so I think, you know, we were able to do some of that. I think there were definitely ways that we could have done that better. I definitely think, you know, the battle for strategy, I think as Bill put it in his article, was not quite there at the convention, but I think is getting there. And I'm pretty happy with that, given that it almost seems like every 2 years we feel like a brand new organization, just with the influx of membership. I've been a member since 2016, and this was my third convention, and so definitely saw that there was more of a spirit of collaboration amongst caucuses, more of a making sure we're very clear about who it is that we're targeting, who are our enemies, naming them, and outlining what type of strategy would need to carry us forward. I think it also brought us into a new scope of work, particularly around abolition, which was obviously very important. And I think, we somewhat missed the opportunity to play a more substantial role during the uprising. But I think that largely led to questions of what does abolition work look like within DSA. I was particularly happy that one of the resolutions I co-authored on voting rights advanced and passed, overwhelmingly on the consent agenda, and I think is going to be a really unique opportunity to both expand the scope of work of DSA, but also bring us to an existing terrain of struggle that is obviously being, targeted and exacerbated by the right as their strategy for moving forward with a plethora of voter suppression bills. I think that's it sort of off the top of my head. I'm going to take it to David, and if there's anything I miss, I can come back.
Thank you. And before David Duhalde, we hear from you, I want to actually say what I meant to say at the very beginning is to, as a non-DSA member, but a socialist myself, to acknowledge that Democratic Socialists of America is the single largest socialist organizing formation in the United States today. There are 95,000 dues-paying members. I believe that is generating about $1 million a month. I mean, for somebody like me who is a socialist, I just acknowledge, not only tip my hat, but really embrace the fact that DSA is a formation growing and on the move. And I'm trying to learn how to best relate to it and figure out how to proceed. So I apologize I didn't start with that. So I do want to say that out loud and then turn to David Duhalde. For Kristian gave us a good overview, I think. I'm going to actually push you, David. Help us understand the various caucuses, help us understand how the votes for the NPC translated and what that meant. David Duhalde.
Sure. Thank you so much, fellow David. And so I'm David Duhalde. I am the vice chair of the Democratic Socialist America Fund. So it's a sister socialist organization to DSA, but so that Kristian sits on the board of. But I've been to 8 conventions myself, though I see people in the crowd who've been to many more. And I just want to say, if you aren't a member of DSA, we welcome socialists of all stripes. So if you want to join, please do after the end of this call, or feel free to reach out to Kristian and I will put our information, I'm sure, in the chat. So I've been to, as I said, conventions very small and very large. My first one probably had, just looking at the chat, had fewer people than are participating in this event today. So I have seen DSA really balloon from when it was about 5,000 people, probably when I first met Bill Fletcher, and a dozen youth chapters and about twice as many community chapters to hundreds now. And I think that, but what I've talked about with a comrade reflecting on the last convention is just because we grow doesn't mean we grow and attract the people who are exactly like us. The organization is much more eclectic now. And I think that, coming out of the convention, there are 3 things I want folks to kind of take away, which is that, DSA, like Kristian said, kind of voted after 2 conventions of changing, to kind of stay the course. And I'll go into that a little bit. And I think that reflects caucuses like the one that Kristian and I belong to, Social Majority Caucus, North Star, where I see people are participating here, people from Collective Power Network, and a few other kind of formations kind of representing this broader kind of consensus view around certain things, especially around electoral politics. And then I'll go into these caucuses later, kind of people who come from, and it's a little esoteric and imperfect, but it's the best one I can think of, kind of a socialism from below tradition, people who are maybe not Trotskyists themselves, but kind of come from that political formation that's focusing on union militancy and kind of independent politics, especially outside of the Democratic Party, but not necessarily with a new party yet. And I think that this kind of was reflected. And the second thing was DSA's not actually kind of coming more together, which kind of Bill talks about in this piece as well, into this kind of internationalism where you saw in the previous conventions, especially in 2017, DSA left the Social Institute International, which is a global association of social democratic parties, but didn't join anything. It's a very American decision to do. It's like, now we're just going to go it alone. And, we did different things. And then kind of created a space where people said, we do need to be part of an international with socialists. And we ended up voting, not unanimously. I voted for it with some reservations, and I know comrades here voted against it, to join the Sao Paulo Forum, which is because we want to really build our relationship with the Americas, and that's an association of parties in the Americas, ranging from like the Chilean Socialist Party and the Sandinista. My piece kind of goes into this more deeply, that's being shared, but DSA didn't make the jump, I feel, into figuring out where it fits into this. I think, as Bill put it, the popular democratic bloc. And so I'll have a piece, coming out, maybe not a piece, it's a chapter in a book about the 2020 elections, where I talk about how DSA was very into Bernie, was part of a coalition of other groups, pro-Bernie groups, and then was the only Bernie group not to stay on to do the anti-Trump work. And so DSA is still figuring out how it doesn't want to be too sectarian, isolate itself, but it doesn't know exactly where it fits in which coalition. And I think this reflects the different tendencies from the different caucuses. So the socialism from below folks would be like Reform and Revolution, who primarily, but not exclusively, come from Socialist Alternative, which is an exclusive Trotsky formation. There are Social Alternative dual Carters who are also coming in. Bread and Roses, which kind of has a lot of people who are from my generation of DSA, but also includes people who have come from the International Socialist Organization, Solidarity. So they kind of are the ones who really pushed, especially anti anything that was like kind of trying to build a coalition with Democratic Party, big D, not the small d that Bill I was talking about earlier, big D forces. And then I think there was a big evolution in this, which I think if there's one thing I want people to take away is that in 2019, we overwhelmingly voted to endorse no one but Bernie Sanders, which I voted against, and I thought it was proved that it was a mistake, because then DSA couldn't relate to the anti-Trump forces. And then when a similar proposal came up this time, not around the presidency, but around, saying our electeds shouldn't endorse corporate Democrats, people voted that down. And I think people were kind of wary of like prescriptive programs that like put DSA in a box for future decisions. And so the people who are really leading that were the Social Majority Caucus, who kind of represent kind of more coalition politics, revolutionary social democracy in a way. North Star, who comes more of my comrades who come really, really like me, who are really part of DSA before 2016, and also Collective Power Network, which is kind of a collective group and some of its splits, who are definitely people who are much more interested in like getting people elected, building with the working class and union movements as they exist now, not necessarily forming militant rank and file caucuses, though they're not mutually exclusive, but they are different fields of work. And I would be remiss to not mention there are also other smaller formations too, like Emerge, which is exclusive in New York, but is like a communist with a small c caucus, who sometimes, especially on like, housing work, we'll relate to Social Majority, but on international, we were not as on the same page with them, especially in terms of internal democracies. So, and then there was the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, who were able to elect, I think, at least one person to the NPC, who are kind of small anarchists, but very much committed to building a large socialist organization. And so you see kind of, and then what I end on here is like, what's a big debate, as my article kind of got a lot of pushback on this one point, not as much on other stuff, was the voting systems the convention chose, I think, kind of blur where the politics of the organization are. So we chose single transferable vote, which I think makes much more sense if you're electing one person, or in like a country where there's tons of ethnic conflicts. Doesn't make sense for an elected leadership that needs consensus. So as opposed to a Borda system, which is simply would be much more like consensus candidates would win. So social majority, I feel that social majority, who the numbers show candidates were on more ballots than a lot of the other candidates who won, did not benefit from that. So we ended up getting 3 seats, Kristian is one of them, as opposed to, I think, the 4 or 5 that probably would have more reflected if we had chosen a more consensus system. And so it allowed, Bread and Roses still got 3, so the socialism from above people Emerge got one, and a handful of other kind of independents got some as well. And so, but what it kind of showed me too, it's very hard to win without a slate. So it's only a handful of independents won, and they were people who were endorsed. And they also did benefit from a lot of people dropping out because there was tons of tension that DSA needs to deal with going in to how we deal with comradely conflict. So it'd be interesting to see, but I haven't heard anything from the NPC, which in some ways I would, as Kristian would know, is a kind of a good thing, because, you know, I think we in DSA were so used to hearing about from the NPC because things were going poorly. And so I think that a lot of still in the end, these national conventions are incredibly important because they kind of set a precedent, but still a lot of the work is going to be done on the local level. And we really look to the NPC to put out statements, to help guide us, to work at the staff. And that was a big thing. The last thing I'll say is, you know, there was the NPC made the outgoing NPC made recommendations that those that were allowed to be heard were overwhelmingly approved, including trying to get more staff. And I think so there's a real kind of hope going out into the convention, out of the convention, that, you know, we're going to work better together, especially after this very tense event. But it's really, but so many things are outside of our control that I'm sure we'll get into, you know, with the political terrain. And that, you know, the last thing I will truly say is David mentioned how we've grown, but that growth has kind of petered off. And it's not because we're not dynamic. It's because actually a lot of the growth has been dependent on national events where people get excited and join DSA, and then DSA can like plug them in, you know, and that we finally did a recruitment drive, you know, last year, which was very successful. That recruited 12,000 people, but that's the first time we were actually being really proactive in the past 4 or 5 years to do a major push. So I'm going to stop there because I wanted to make sure other people talk, but I just wanted to give that kind of caucus view as well.
This is Mel Figueroa. I'm here and also helping to drive this conversation. Thank you for those reports, David and Kristian. I have a question about, again, this caucus, what seems to be a caucus-driven process within the NPC. And it appears that this caucus-driven process kind of reflects the, not just also like the sort of institutional kind of left institutions also kind of, you know, coalescing around certain caucuses, but also struggle over influence on the national organization's positions, platform, and strategy that might reflect attitudes of the rank and file, but there's doesn't seem to be a lot of mechanism to confirm whether or not that's the case, to get feedback from the locals. Like you said, that there's local work that's being done and then on the national level. So I also am intrigued by some of the stuff you've said about collaboration and how like sort of the collaborative resolutions were more successful than others. So like how does that process you've described in terms of the success of some resolutions maybe inform what you see as the role of the national organization going forward, and also the need to you know, engage some of the local chapters that are doing work at the local level? I mean, for example, I'm a member of a small rural DSA chapter, and, you know, we do a lot of work on the ground in the community, but like where the national organization is at is like, you know, we'll discuss it at kind of chat about it at meetings, but not necessarily reflecting on our, you know, affecting our work, what we do on the ground. So yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts about connecting this to the rank and file more broadly, and also, you know, what you're seeing as things that might help towards that.
To be honest, was that question directed at me, or should Kristian go first? I just don't want to skip her. Yeah.
You know, I'm going to actually ask both of you, because you've got unique perspectives, both of you to react to what you heard. Kristian, why don't you start?
I can start. I think David can talk a little bit more about the caucuses in particular, but I would say, I think, you know, there is sort of a prevailing, I mean, I don't know how prevalent is, I should say. There is an existing current that sort of puts this opposition as far as the local and the national, which I don't think is the correct way of viewing it. Because to me, like, right now we just got word that a candidate in Pinellas, Richie Floyd, looks likely to be advancing to the general election, which is amazing. And a win there in Florida is a win in every single other part of the country and has a lasting impact. I'm in North Texas, and we saw when AOC was elected an influx in the number of people who joined North Texas, specifically because we saw the win and took that opportunity, to recruit members, and people got excited about DSA, so we took that opportunity. And I think that's sort of the thing that we need to really carry forward, and I'm hopeful that we can do that under this current NPC term, is that there isn't sort of this tension between small chapters and large chapters. It's a matter of all of us can win together when we work together, and we saw that very successfully with the recruitment drive, and we've seen that in other instances where we've come together, whether that's through external political crisis, or whether that's through having some intentional campaign within DSA. And so I think a lot of that is there is a lot of work to be done to make sure that the decisions and things that are moving are demystified for our membership. Absolutely. And I think, not have this overburdened level of chapter leaders and national leaders that sort of seem to be in the know, and then other folks sort of hopping on. But I think that a lot of that is honestly a lot of growing pains. We went from being a very small organization to a very big one, and a lot of folks are organizing for the first time and really confronting what it means to do that in a way that's effective, and still sort of figuring it out by trial and error. So I definitely think that there's been a lot of concrete work. I know the last NPC term, we had a lot of one-on-ones with new chapters, specifically to have a face to what national was with different chapters, which I think is super important. But obviously also there are only 16 of us, and there are 244 chapters. So, again, I think this work is building on itself, and is super important, but definitely is going to be something that moving forward, we did make a recommendation for state organizations as a way of having both confronting a very specific terrain of struggle when it comes to the fights that need to happen at the state level, but also as a way of making sure that the different chapters within states are connected and working together, whether that's for, to elect somebody, or it's specifically to fight back against, state preemption bills and things like that. So I'll leave the rest of that to David.
And David Duhalde, before we hear from you, I do want to lift up Joe Ramsey's question and ask you to reflect not only on what you heard from Mel, but a very basic question that Joe from Shelter in Solidarity asked, and that is, are there unaligned members? How many DSA members actually, we can talk about the caucuses and what they represent, but how impactful are they? What are those numbers, to hear what the numerical breakdown is there? So turn it over to you.
Sure. So I think that's a good way. I'll start with Joe's question because I think it'll really help answer Mel's question. So there can't be, and people can correct me in the chat, I don't think there's probably more than 1,000, maybe 2,000 if you count very liberally, people actually in caucuses. And I think, so that means the vast majority of members of the 95,000 are not. But that also, you have to factor in that, probably only 10%, not only because that's still pretty high compared to other civic society organizations, but let's say I think about 10% of DSA members are truly active. And of those, there's probably a third of those are super cadre, people who are giving 5 hours or more a week. So the caucuses are a much larger section of the cadre, of the 5,000 to 8,000 people who are really running the organization day to day. And I think that what my comrade John Heppen said too is even people on in caucuses, I've gone in and out, you value the caucuses, you value political parties or any civic society who tells you, gives you their opinion on things to vote on, tells you what they think, so I think there's still a value in that, even if I think they're imperfect, and some of them can be kind of divisive in their own ways, in that they get smaller and smaller because they sometimes are victims of their own success and they achieve their goal and then they don't really have anything else to do. And I think then to kind of shift, and just in shifting to Mel's question, I think the big fight in 2019 was, did DSA want to be a centralized organization, or did it want to be a decentralized organization? The centralized won out. So that leads to the question of, like, then how do you have a democratic centralization, democratic centralism? How do you, especially I think and the problem that's being identified by Mel and came out of the convention is, you have, as Kristian said, there's 16 MPC members, there's like 24 staff, and they have to serve, over 250 chapters and 95,000 members. That's not possible for them to like have meaningful relationships in the same way. So what we are going towards, social majority of the proposal that was defeated, which was to kind of create essentially like a Congress in between the members, chapters, and the MPC. That was defeated, so we don't have to think about that too much. What was passed, which I think will make a difference, is an effort to form state organizations and also a matching funds program that will work with the national and chapters co-fundraising together, as opposed to what I call robbing Peter to pay Paul, as opposed to like just giving money to chapters and hope it works out, teaching people to fundraise together, to hire local staff. And I think the story I'll give is which was why this is important, is I wasn't living in New York at the time, but I was following it because I grew up in New York. Was DSA, the New York City DSA was talking about if they wanted to endorse Cynthia Nixon or not. And it was making Politico, and all I kept thinking about was why isn't there a conversation with the chapters upstate? It's a statewide office, and so a huge problem too is it's not really the national, there's nothing the national can do to tell a chapter whether to not endorse people, but you want to develop a culture where people think about statewide policy, especially in this country that is a federal system where the states are so important. And I think that move towards state organizations is going to be incredibly important, because I think that will tie in smaller and larger chapters will have to work together in ways that they will probably need some national help, but that's ultimately that work will have to be done by them. And that's what I'm excited about, because I think there's, some of us as socialists were good about, we're thinking about nationwide scale, but in the United States, states are pretty big, and so I think this organizing in your state is really, really important hard work to do, and people should, and I think that's an effort in the right direction, because I think, and so I'll stop there.
Thank you. David, do you have it, or David Cobb, I guess, do you have any other questions before we move on to the next section?
Well, so many, but I want to get Bill Fletcher's voice into this conversation, and I'm going to ask you to kick us off there.
Sure, absolutely. So now we're going to move on to the eminent Bill Fletcher Jr. and a discussion of his really, really thought-provoking and excellent article on the modern prince, or the modern Tecumseh, as he calls it. So first off, Bill, I'd like to I'm going to let you outline sort of the basic framework of your argument in this article. You're talking about sort of the need for an organization to meet the needs of the moment and the particularities of the United States as a racialized settler state. So what does this kind of unity look like? The outlines of constructing a popular democratic bloc. And I love that, as a Gramsci scholar myself, I love that you draw upon the ideas of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist who wrote during the sort of pre-fascist and also during the fascist period, that has a lot of lessons for us all. So so outline your basic argument, and what are the elements you might see today for such a historic popular democratic bloc that could move us towards a radical and transformational struggle? And what are the strategic imperatives and needs that you see towards building that kind of grand coalition?
So thank you, Melissa. And my congratulations again to DSA on this convention. So as you pointed out, the essay that I wrote in Monthly Review was inspired by the way that Antonio Gramsci made reference to Italian history and the issue of the prince from Machiavelli's work, and used it as an allegory, describing both the role of the Italian Communist Party, or the role that he believed it should play, but also looking at broader issues of strategy in the historical context of Italy. I have been interested for years in Tecumseh. And for those of you unfamiliar with Tecumseh, the article gives a summary of who he was. He was a Shawnee leader in the first decade of the 19th century. And he was a remarkable leader. And what I did was I looked at his life and his work. So it's not a biography, but it's looking at his work and tried to draw out certain lessons that I think are relevant to today. And I was doing that in order to move a discussion about strategy within the socialist left. I would argue we do not really talk about strategy. We talk about tasks. We talk about ideology. We position ourselves, but we don't really talk about strategy. And we frequently, as members of the socialist left, have this sort of jump over the Grand Canyon view. In other words, it's we talk about how bad things are under our current situation. And then the only answer we come up with is socialism. So we jump over the Grand Canyon and we land in the world of socialism. And we rarely talk about, well, how do you actually get across the Grand Canyon? I mean, do you need a helicopter? Do you fly? I mean, what do you do? And so what I wanted to do with this piece was to encourage people to engage in discussions of strategy. I think that there's many lessons from what Tecumseh attempted. Tecumseh was basically attempting to build a response to the white settlers coming west. But he understood the history of the Native American resistance such that he concluded a different form of organization was necessary, actually two different forms. One was based in what came to be known as Prophetstown. Some people talked about it as Tippecanoe. And the other was a much broader front, a confederacy of indigenous nations, which it has been argued, I think convincingly, he hoped would transform into an indigenous nation state, and that would be the mechanism to block the westward expansion. What I found fascinating in looking at the life of Tecumseh was understanding the question of timing. And it's something that I would argue that the left also doesn't appreciate, that you have certain times in time periods in order to operate. And if you blow it, you may not get that opportunity again. This is not just true for the left, it's true for the right. That understanding the nature of the moment, what's going on, and what the possibilities are critical. So the article is really attempting to get to that. And it's rather than going on and on, let me just suggest, one is that it is saying that you have to have an actual concrete analysis of US history. The second is that there's an essential need for a national left organization, socialist left organization, that has as its main objective, not the idea of conquering power in its own name, but in building a popular democratic bloc, of building a majoritarian movement that can win. But in order to get there, we have to engage in the struggle for governing power right now. In other words, we cannot be sitting back and letting politics be played out by liberals and conservatives and fascists, that we have to be involved. And that necessitates more than just the socialist left engaging. We need broader formations, left progressive formations. And it's suggesting that that's what's necessary right now. And this is framed in my argument that the principal contradiction, and the article explains why I use the term contradiction, is between the forces of what I would call the neo-confederacy and the forces for democracy. That we are not right now fighting a battle for socialism. In other words, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be for socialism. It's saying that there's a very immediate threat. And that threat is summarized by the confluence of right-wing corporatist authoritarians and right-wing populists. And within the right-wing populace, there's a fascist current. And we have to be building a movement that smashes these forces. And that movement is not simply about demonstrations. It's a movement actually that is, in fact, fighting for power. And so those are some of the key features of the article.
Great, thank you. Before I move on to the next question, I do have an announcement from the tech folks. Apparently there is a tech glitch that has frozen us in gallery mode. So if you do not want to be live streamed, please. So sorry, just a little technical announcement there. Bill, I'm really intrigued by this, and especially as somebody who, again, being faced with a lot of the fascist threats early on in 2017 in Berkeley got me really thinking about this question of the United Front and the question of strategy that meets the conjuncture, as Gramsci called it. Now, it's very interesting because, in the historical context of the United Front, there are a lot of people on the ground in communities that were may have been from different parties in the electoral or the formal political realm in Germany, but that it was and in Italy but on the community level, people were just trying to defend themselves against this onslaught forces in the streets and in the and in the local state apparatuses. And so there's a really interesting tension in there between this kind of like the notion of centralized party government that had been governance that had been kind of hegemonic, I guess, before, and that Gramsci saw the need of that, and I'll quote from him here, that historically a party is never definitive and never will be. It will pass through a whole series of transitory phases and will from time to time absorb new elements in relation to the conjunctural moments. This for me really actually describes a lot of what DSA is going through now, that certain conjunctures, certain struggles will, have an influx of new elements, and that, the party for Gramsci, as well as what I'm seeing now, kind of has to, takes on a kind of living character. So to retain this living character also, Gramsci observed that organizational work, the tenacious and difficult struggle to maintain the party apparatus are certainly important, but it is not on these things that we can draw up a balance sheet of the party. It is not enough just to live, we must have a history. So I guess my question for you, Bill, is what are the trajectories that you see in this conjuncture and for the potential, like living, like character of the organization and potential transformations, and what can you see would be essential for a large left organization to be more dynamic in this fast changing situation and to be responsive to the challenges posed by this conjuncture, not just also the rise of the right, but also climate change, global pandemics, and the transformations in the wider political economy that are happening to us right now as a result.
Let me try to answer that by making 3 points. One, with regard to DSA, as I said on another webinar, DSA has to fundamentally decide if it's a federation or a socialist organization. And so the fact of growing and numbers is really good. But at the end of the day, the question is, can people be deployed? Can the organization mount major campaigns? Does it have deep ties with the critical social movements? Do people look to DSA for leadership? And I don't mean just practical leadership, but also worldview. And is there enough that DSA stands for that whether you're in Spokane or whether you're in Sioux Falls or whether you're in South Carolina, you can recognize a DSA member? And this becomes very, very important. I'm not talking about building all due respect, I think that some of the factions care more about the factions than they do about DSA, and that they're not thinking about where are we moving the organization as a whole. And so that's point number one. The second point is that one of the arguments I try to make in the article, and I've made it in other places, is that a left movement is going nowhere in the United States unless it has a good understanding of racism and national question. It just simply isn't. And this is much more than people being individually committed to anti-racism and being good people. It is about understanding the construction of the United States and the centrality of race and national oppression, settler colonialism in a construction, because that then tells you something about, in looking at the organization, where does the organization need to grow? With whom? What partnerships need to be built? What unification processes need to be undertaken, et cetera. So that's, I think that this is really critical, and that the organization, to the extent that it has multiple views on race and national oppression, is going to run itself into a cul-de-sac. And I'm hoping that that doesn't happen, but it really necessitates a deeper discussion, understanding US history and what it has meant in different social movements. Reluctant Reform is just being reissued. A very good book for people to really look at. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has a new book out, This Is Not a Nation of Immigrants. And I think that it's really important to engage in broad study in order to move this. It doesn't mean that the organization, that everyone is going to line up, right? But it means that the organization has to have a point of view that people can look at and say, all right, we get it. We understand this. The third thing is that why I keep coming back to this issue about the fight for governing power is that too many of us on the left have what I call the surfer's view of socialist revolution. And the surfer's view is this: you get on your surfboard and you paddle out, right? And you get out far enough and you wait for the right wave and you look, and then all of a sudden you see that wave. You stand up on a surfboard and boom, you just brought into landing, and it's perfect. And many of us think that's the way struggle operates, that we get on our perfect surfboard, our pure surfboard, and we sit out there waiting for the rise of the mass struggle that's just going to bring us, and I emphasize us, into power, as opposed to understanding that we actually are trying to build a movement and multiple movements. And that's what makes this actually quite interesting, and also necessitates that an organization like DSA, we need as part of the force that's helping to build that popular democratic bloc, and is looking not simply to operate in its own name, but it's looking to give a name and identity to the popular democratic bloc, which is the point that I didn't mention, but I'll just mention quickly: the issue of identity. That we have become obsessed with identity in terms of recognizing that, I'm an African American, I am heterosexual, I am this and that. All of those things are important, but for revolutionary movements to succeed, the movement itself has to have an identity that brings together the different social forces so that they look at the movement and feel that they are part of it. They have an identity in that movement, whether we see like in the Civil War and the identity with the Union, right? And the opposition to the Confederacy, or what Mao talked about in terms of identifying the people, or even in our own situation with Occupy, what they attempted to do with the 99%. You've got to give the popular democratic bloc an identity, but it can't be an identity that is mush, which is my final point, which is the greatest danger in the United States, where people think, all right, let's bring everybody together and let's not talk about race, right? Let's not talk about national oppression. Let's not talk about gender, because that will divide us. And that kind of thinking about identity will ensure that we lose. as opposed to understanding a sort of revolutionary notion of identity, which I think that Gramsci, Mao, Cabral, and other people attempted to identify.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to jump in because, and I really appreciate that you bring in Cabral specifically, because what was in my head was, never forget that the people are not fighting for ideas. They're fighting for concrete, tangible things, right? And so my question really to you, and also to Kristian and David and all DSA members, is this kind of notion, like, again, as a comrade who is looking in, as socialist, yes, I am a registered Green, but you know what? I'm not an electoral fetishist. I engage in electoral politics because it's a front of struggle, and it's where I think that political conversation can take place. But I have a keen appreciation for the profound limits of electoral bourgeois politics. And so, Bill, I ask you again as a comrade, and I'm going to ask Kristian and David to sort of reflect on this as well. One of the things that I find disconcerting is that all the electoral energy, like, yes, it's an important thing, but all that electoral energy, like the Democratic Socialists of America are using NGP Van as their database, which is to say all that data, all that work that you're doing literally gets fed to the Democratic National Committee, which is basically the old Democratic Leadership Council, right? Like the corporatists and neoliberals control that party. So the database issue, and number two, Action Network itself. And so all the apparatuses that are being used are literally being used to allow the neoliberals who control that party to constrain what we as socialists would do, or what DSA does. And I'm wondering, Bill, I'll start with you to ask, am I being uncharitable? Or do you see that kind of question? Because it feels like it really gets to the very heart of, like, if we're going to really like cross the Grand Canyon, we got to meet people's needs. We got to show people that our approach feeds them, clothes them, educates their kids, provides healthcare. I mean, this is something that is really different than a mere electoral struggle. So I'll go to you first, Bill, and then we'll again invite Kristian and David, because I do mean this in a genuinely comradely, constructive critique. Bill?
So a few things to that, man. So first, I don't know of any electoral struggle that is mere. But and I'll come back to that. But the second thing is that I'm not worried about whether people get resources from the DNC, Democratic National Committee, or whatever. The Soviet Union got tanks from the imperialist United States, which they used against the Nazis. I don't remember anyone saying, wait a minute, stop, hold it, stop the ships of the Atlantic. We cannot take those tanks from the United States. The question is, who is running the tanks, right? And we've got to be thinking about how do we utilize whatever resources in order to advance our particular objective, which is why we have to have a better sense of strategy. And strategy is not just about electoral work, it's about winning. And so it necessitates thinking about the variety of different spheres in which we need to be operating. There's a particular thing about elections I'll come back to in a second, but it's about the work in the trade union movement. It's about cooperatives. It's about prisoner defense work. It's about any number of things. And so strategy has to take all of those things into account. And that means that DSA needs to be thinking about multiple levels and not just one thing. But the issue with electoral work, David, is this. And this is where I know that Cabral quote you used. And I would say, I love Cabral, right? But Cabral, that quote was mainly being targeted against dogmatists who thought of revolution in terms of ideas alone. The reality is that people fight for ideas and they fight for material changes. People believe in things, and to the extent that they don't believe in things, they're not going to win. People are inspired by visions. They're inspired by ideas about a different kind of world. And to the extent that we are successful, it's because we've linked that desire for a different world and those ideas with the fight for concrete changes in people's material reality. So both of those things have to go on at the same time. The electoral battle is a fight to change people's lives. And one of the problems is that we have been fighting a rearguard action against neoliberalism and now increasingly the neo-Confederacy for 40 plus years. The question that many people want to know is, what will we do if we're in power? What difference will it make if the progressives get elected? What difference will it make if we take control of the city council? What are our ideas about developing manufacturing in a different way? How can we actually do that if we win? Can we use political office to implement eminent domain against various kinds of capitalists and speculators so we can seize land and property and start creating cooperatives or space for cooperatives? So the electoral battle is this battle for governing power. It is a battle to change the context in which people are living out their lives. It cannot just be about Tweedledum Tweedledee or putting a good person into office. It's about what's the program, and it's also about the difficult task of holding people accountable. And this is going to be true no matter who is elected. And we're going to have to be careful that we understand that when people are elected, they're not necessarily going to do everything that we want them to do. And that doesn't make them automatically traitors. And this is something within the left that we fall prey to all the time, that if people do not embrace in our platform completely, or don't, once they're elected, do everything that we hope, all of a sudden we're ready to turn away from electoral politics and throw rocks at them and denounce them as traitors. So it's a long answer, David, forgive me.
Thanks. I want to open up Cobb's question to David, Duhalde, and Kristian as well, if you want to respond quickly to that.
Yeah, I can go ahead and start a little bit, and then I think David can get maybe more into the technical parts of it. But really, I mean, I appreciate, Bill, what you said about, what I like to call and what I learned as like the mushy middle, right? The people who, maybe don't have super coherent politics, but are making up this like segment of the working class that can be won over on some fights, maybe less so on others, and I think it's important to be able to implement that type of coalition approach, because I think if we're going for a politics of always being right, that's not going to lead us to win. And I think on the second point, I always really draw on Audre Lorde's, there are no new ideas, only new ways of having them felt. And I do think like feeling has both like the material consequences, but also the inspirational ones. And I think that's ever most present right now, particularly during the pandemic, where things can feel very dreary and overwhelming, and people's capacity can really suffer from just sort of feeling like we're, starting from scratch, or we're not able to do things in the same way. But really being able to see the opportunity that comes from these types of crisis, and being able to move forward in that. And I think the other part of it, particularly around the issue of governance, and building that accountability, for me, I think that's the main thing is we aren't just sort of like waging campaigns for the sake of getting all this data. We're also doing it for the sake of building deep relationships with people in different parts of the country. And I think that's super important. I mean, I'm sure I'm on quite a few lists. It doesn't mean that they can tell me what to do. I definitely know where my loyalty lies, and that's rooted in relationships that I've built, which I think also plays a big role as we're developing, socialist candidates and candidates in office. What does it mean to have a socialist in office, which I think is a big question that came up during the convention, and we're sort of learning as we go. I think particularly looking at places like New York, where we've really been able to like pull people literally from our ranks and have them elected to office. And I think that relationship looks very different than someone who we recognize as, hey, like they mostly agree with what we have to say and endorse them and they win. And, then it proves a little harder to be able to implement a strategy in office. And so I think it's work that's developing, and definitely really appreciate, the points that were made by Bill. I'll take it over to David for more.
Sure. Thanks, Kristian and Bill. And I appreciate David's question. I think, broadly speaking, I think it's important to remember that we live in the United States. And so electoral politics gets a lot of undeserved attention. And so DSA actually does a ton of work that's not electoral. The problem is, I feel that, and it's with the media, whether you're watching the presidential race or you're a DSA member today who's getting excited about Richie Floyd winning a seat, it's something very tangible. So for my day-to-day life, I'm a union member in a small independent public sector union, and I really rely on DSA members to help me kind of navigate through my contract. But that you guys don't know about that. Why would I'm not going to tweet about it. So people don't see that kind of invaluable social network and social movements that come together, because it's not sexy, for lack of a better term. It's important, it's critical as socialists to build working class power. But those aren't the things people see. People see elections. And so that really kind of drives a lot of attention, and it gets a lot of, I think, sometimes overcorrections. What Kristian was talking about specifically at the convention were like efforts that were defeated to make DSA members who got elected, give money back to DSA, which I think would have been totally unenforceable, to make people accountable to the platform, which would have then caused a lot of people to be unendorsed, because it would have been, the platform was 1,000 different points, and if they disagree with one, so I do think there's a consensus with what Bill's saying is you don't have to agree with everything, but we have to work together. And I think it's much more moving towards what Kristian is talking about. So I'm sure people here would agree of actually not just electing people who say they're socialists, join DSA or whatever, but people really have come from the movement, have a movement vision, like what Bill's talking about, people who want concrete gains, but also have a world view, and who want to build something in and outside. But socialists have to remember, and I talked about this on the panel that Bill's referencing, that we're not winning things alone, and that there's this false narrative that kind of comes out that DSA is winning things by itself. It's just not true, and then ultimately also these electeds have to serve other people who are not DSA members and have to listen to their constituents the way the system is made up. But I think when I push back on what David is saying, and people said in the chat, one, DSA has some independence in the data, but let's not get lost in the technical details. But I think there was an interesting push that was defeated at the convention, which is to explore alternatives to VAN, which is the database program for canvassing. And that would be prohibitively expensive, so I think, and that people are also kind of pointing out that like me, it's well, the Democrats really were terrible, were a threat, to a certain extent, they would kick us off VAN too. So it's this awkward dance everyone is doing, whether it's the Democratic establishment and DSA, where you kind of need each other, because you still need people to canvass, you still need people to fill in the data, so you don't want to push these people away too far. You also don't want to become too dependent on the establishment, which is why I think in the end, I think there's a push away from kind of the official stance of we're going to build an independent workers' party, to a more traditional kind of sense of a workers' party with a small p. That's really what Bill is talking about, a democratic mass socialist organization. What I want is to push is to have that be part of something bigger than itself, and not just be the left. As I don't want DSAers to think DSA is the left. But I don't think tensions with the Democratic Party, whatever that means, which I sometimes feel is more a social construct than a real thing in our minds, are really worth the fights that people make it out. Because I think in the end, people need victories, and sometimes electoral wins provide that in ways that it takes much longer to get other victories to happen.
Thank you. And so just one final thought. It's I know we're running a little late, but I really wanted to throw this out there because Bill, I was really intrigued by your invoking of Tecumseh's project of a confederacy, pan-indigenous confederacy, in conjunction with what Gramsci was saying, and the question of forming a mechanism for subjective and functional unity amongst a number of parties. So achieving functional unity within a large diversity, right, of interests, struggles, conditions, etc. So I'm not Native, but I live in a Native household, and I work with tribes and tribal governments on issues relating to climate change and asserting sovereignty and environmental stewardship. So, your article got me thinking, and I asked, the tribal members I work with about, Tecumseh's project, the idea of a pan-Indigenous confederacy, and the question of how that is viewed in Indian country and what they talk about it. And their answer was very interesting to me. While it wasn't, realized in Tecumseh's lifetime, it was sort of kind of de facto achieved from above in the evolution of federal Indian law, namely in the Snyder Act of 1924, in which the federal government was directed to treat all tribes as one entity, and thus all legal decisions and policies that are developed in relation to federally recognized tribal governments, even if it's determined through a single local struggle, thus affects all tribes. So this led to the eventual creation of the National Congress of American Indians as an advocacy body to kind of aggregate all these tribal interests. And an interesting observation I've made in my experience is that, tribes all over become way more invested in the outcomes of individual struggles. So and of course, this really came together in a very inspiring way around Standing Rock. Of course, there's all kinds of contradictions within that and being a sort of governmental body. But it's interesting how the NCAI works, and kind of with a flexible system of committees and consortiums for tribes, especially smaller and less powerful nations, and non-Native organizations and agencies to collaborate on particular issues, right? But while avoiding being sort of locked into like a huge centralized programmatic unity. So it did get me thinking that, DSA chapters, like tribes, are place-based and have varied interests and struggles based on the conditions of these geographic areas. And I see a lot of folks talking about that in the chat as well. So it not only moves the question to identity, as you noted in the article, but also to questions of action and how to facilitate actions across geographies as well as identities. So I know I'm throwing out a lot here and kind of some new stuff, but it's interesting how this perspective might help to inform organizational questions for an outfit like DSA, which is also tasked with the challenge of kind of aggregating and advocating for a number of place-based struggles, and to, the challenge, as you noted, to be rooted within the oppressed and dispossessed and be an integral component of such struggles. So I know this is probably a lot, but I'm just wondering real quick what your impressions might be about that, and if there's any lessons to be learned there.
Well, I'm glad that we're going to extend this webinar for another couple of hours. So that will give me plenty of time to address this in a very relaxed fashion. Well, let me tackle part of this. I think that what I learned in looking at Tecumseh, but also thinking about Gramsci and Mao, is that an organization or a party is not a puppeteer. It doesn't control legitimate mass movements, and it has a relationship at its best with these different mass movements. And one of the things that Tecumseh was attempting to do was build a relationship among the tribes that both respected their identity as tribes, but also said that they needed to have a greater collective identity as indigenous people in North America, in opposition to the white settler regime based in Washington, D.C. And I said, okay, this is really interesting. So it's not like, let's collapse everything together. It's recognizing multiple levels of identity, but that there is this collective identity that can grip us and can actually inspire us. That's what I think we've got to be, those two things we've got to be thinking about. One, that not everything comes through the party or the organization. The social movements are going to be autonomous. We have to, at best, build a good relationship with them. And then building an identity for the popular democratic bloc in our fight for socialist transformation, that people can look at and see in that bloc themselves. They see their interests represented, and not simply mushed together, but that their interests are truly represented. So it's walking a tough line, but that's the one I think we have to walk.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
So,
All right, with that, I'll throw to David. Go ahead.
thank you. And I want to bring Matt Nelson into the conversation, and with an apology that it's taken so long to get your voice into this, Matt. But, Presente.org is probably the single most important Latinx formation, at least in the digital world, that exists. So I want to ask you for any broad reactions or reflections you've been hearing, and to very specifically ask, where do you see Presente.org fitting into this, quote, historic block that we're hearing from Bill? So Matt Nelson.
Right, and thank you so much, everybody. It's great to be here amongst friends and comrades. Yeah, Matt Nelson, Executive Director of Presente.org. I've been honored to be called a cool Executive Director by members of the DSA, which I know is like a high level compliment. And so I'm honored to be here. I grew up in the Midwest. I was born in Colombia. I grew up in Minneapolis, so that makes me a proud Minneolumbian. And Presente has been around for, 12 years now. I do want to just start by just really thanking the other panelists and really appreciating Bill's piece. One of the things that kept circling in my head is like, what I read from it and what I get from Bill and others is your commitment to our freedom. What it kept on telling me, like what I kept on hearing is like, I'm committed to your freedom. And I think that as we endure the so many crises that we're enduring, that to me is part of what we need to be rooted in. We need to be rooted in committing to each other's freedom, to committing to our own freedom, and understanding then what that means in practice. And it is an act of love, it is an act of solidarity. And so I want to appreciate and just acknowledge that I recognize that in Bill's piece and in the work of the DSA. It is a commitment to our freedom. Just a couple other reflections is I used to run a pizzeria in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we had somebody used to come to the pizzeria once a month. It was the only place he would come to eat. He would only go out once a month because he was at that time probably pushing 90. And it was Frank Zeidler. Frank Zeidler was the last socialist mayor of Milwaukee. And he used to come and convene his group, his socialist group that he had been convening, for probably the better part of 40 or 50 years. And he would meet in our pizzeria, and every month there would be a topic, and it would be a strategy session, and it would be first with history. So he would, for instance, come in and he'd say, let's talk about how a county develops a park system in public space in the commons. And then for a few hours, we would talk a little bit about the history, but then we would strategize about what it means to have a relationship with governance and governing, and what really it means to have public spaces and democratic socialism. And it was this amazing experience that I think, taught me a lot about what it means to do organizing. We definitely have to have this strategy. We also have to have this narrative power. There is power in our stories. We're made up of stories, the experiences we have, and that motivates people. And I think, as we've all sort of had to reflect on what our most important relationships are, that should really root us in the fundamental practice of organizing, which is relationship building. And if we don't have that foundation, and we don't have a way to inspire people through imagination, through visionary political imagination, then we miss out on something that really motivates us, which is caring, which is, again, like caring about each other's freedom. So in terms of some of the other pieces around thinking about this time as, yes, it is a time of great crises, but it's also a time of great abundance, as we heard from the expansion of DSA and other organizations, including, Presente, and I'll talk a little bit about our new formation, Alianza Presente. There is, in terms of social justice, social movement work, there is great abundance. There's a lot more funding coming. So many of our issues are now not as in the margins as they were. We've sort of moved to a place where people need us. People need the left. The left stock has gone up, so to speak, no pun intended. And we're at a place that we need to understand that abundance and ask ourselves, what do right-sized organizations look like? What do we really need to understand in terms of our history? And, from Presente's point of view, is we are integrating with Alianza Americas, strategically integrating, internally integrating. And Alianza Americas is a group of 55 migrant and refugee-led organizations around the country and in Central America. So that, referring to, referencing Bill's piece, it makes us a transnational and translocal organization. It gives us a transnational heart. It gives us a core belief in, challenging inequities and proposing solutions, but not just from a U.S. context. We're known for a lot of our immigrant rights work, but we know we can't do immigrant rights work without a transnational consciousness. We know that part of the human rights work we do has to include the fundamental right of mobility, the fundamental practice of co-powering migrant voices and leadership in working side by side with organizations in Central America and in Puerto Rico and in Mexico. And being that as a US Latinx organization has been really important to deepen the work we've done. I think the other piece that sort of has defined us in the last few years is our commitment to adding value to abolition. And part of how we've added value to abolition is trying to abolish the private prison industry. And, we've made pretty substantial progress in bankrupting that industry. We've been able to force 9 banks to pull $2.3 billion of funding in the last 3 years. And we understand that, the privatized incarceration, which is basically slavery, if we're able to abolish that, that can actually get us in alignment with a larger abolition movement, and also gives us a lane around this addressing the connection of white supremacy and corporate domination, which we feel like is a central challenge and threat. And we've of course seen that alliance of corporate domination, white supremacy in the climate crisis and in a lot of the other work we do. And so those are I do want to make sure that people are paying attention to the Line 3 fight. I spent a week on White Earth Reservation about a month and a half ago, and just understanding that type of incredible organizing, the depth that they have, also how they're not just, stopping the construction of Line 3, but they're also in the practice of showing us what the just transition looks like, showing us what an alternative economy should look like. So I want to make sure that just to highlight that people should be following and supporting that. I do want to make sure, I don't know if it was planned for the agenda, just to shout out and recognize Glenn Ford, who is a friend and, and somewhat of an inspiration and a mentor. And Glenn and others who have passed, were also the connection for me to deeper fundamental US social movements. And, as many people may or may not know, Glenn used to work for a radio station owned by James Brown. So Glenn had all this depth and history about that, which is just this mind-blowing piece of media justice and social movements that we don't often learn about unless you were lucky enough to hear it from people like Glenn Ford. The other thing that's just been on our mind a lot is what does this period of regathering mean? And what are I totally agree with the importance of timing. And we're in an incredible period where we're understanding and trying to figure out how to regather as a society. And us as movement builders and as solidarity practitioners should be the ones really leading the conversation about how we regather and what that means for us being in a place to put forth and win transformative demands.
Thank you, Matt. So much there. And I've been following a very rich conversation in the chat. I'm going to turn to Joe, who is one of the regulars at Shelter in Solidarity, to ask a couple of those questions. Before I do, I want to pick up, Matt, you said a lot, but this notion of like, as we regather and line 3, I want to tie it back to what I thought was Bill's strong endorsement of community land trust, worker-owned cooperatives, public banking. I mean, this is the program that I see, and not a dogmatic program, but there is a way that we can, at the local level, municipal level, county level, and even state level, advance a socialist agenda around non-reformist reforms. This is my plug for the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, and also the work that I do at Cooperation Humboldt, and our experiment with the Wiyot tribe to create an indigenous-led community land trust where white folks are behind the Wiyot tribe, but in a genuine partnership. Like, there are things happening now that were unthinkable, at least in my world, 10 years ago. So with that, Joe, I want to ask you to take some of those juicy comments and give us a few.
All right, thank you, David. Thank you, David and Mel, for guest co-hosting the Shelter in Solidarity space. As always on Shelter in Solidarity, we try to bring in voices from our audience participants before the night is through. But to streamline things a little bit tonight, I've been tasked with actually rather than calling on folks, as fun as that can be, going to read out comments from 3 people who have written eloquent, I think, poignant things in the chat box in case folks missed them, and for those who are not in the chat box but who are watching this later or on Facebook. First, we have from one of our longtime co-producers, Tim Sheard. Shout out to Tim. Tim writes, I think he addressed it to Bill, but it could be perhaps for anyone. Bill, to build a majoritarian bloc of activists who have a shared identity in that movement sense, who are inspired, energized, dedicated, do we not need some sort of secular spiritual movement that explains our place in the world, that offers a kind of personal salvation in this world through collective struggle, that builds a world in harmony with nature, that is anti-racist, anti-capitalist, etc. I want to tag on to that, to Tim's question, Bill, something I said in the chat, I wrote in the chat box myself, but in reading your article, I was very struck by your reference with Tecumseh and to Mao to the kind of liberated base areas and the importance of these geographic zones, both to kind of cadre activist development and identity formation in a revolutionary sense, but also to kind of like exemplary practice that could give concrete proof that the world could be somewhat different. So I'm actually interested in everyone's thoughts on that, but Tim asked that to Bill. I'm going to give you, I hope y'all can just like take a couple notes here because I want to get all these questions out, and then people can, maybe we can move around. David can go to whoever he thinks is most appropriate for each. John Lawrence asked, another regular on Shelter in Solidarity, a very pressing question. Why hasn't there been a united front effort to defend our voter rights this summer? What has DSA been doing on that? And he also asks what Black Lives Matter has been doing on that. It seems, he writes, that we are losing the possibility of democracy without a fight. One quick final question from Paul Baiachi, who flags the acute importance of the ecological crisis, pointing out that there hasn't been really much reference of climate change, environment, green jobs, Green New Deal in this conversation, as great as it's been. So I guess, pardon me for paraphrasing your question, Paul Baiachi, but how does the environmental crisis fit into strategy as you all see it? Thanks, David. Back to you.
Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to do it like this. I'm going to go to Bill specifically on the spiritual question. The United Front, I really felt like DSA was like specifically asked about as it relates to voting rights. So I'll ask Kristian or David Duhalde to respond to that, and then either Matt or Mel on the ecological crisis. So let's go in that order and try to get some like be conscious of the fact that we're already 85 minutes into our time. So Bill.
Well, this will be easy. I would answer Tim by saying that every great movement needs a philosophical foundation. And I don't know whether I'd call it a secular spiritual, but I do think that there is absolutely a role for spiritualism and faith in the kind of revolutionary movement that we need to be building. And I think that we particularly saw that with the development of various forms of liberation theology in the 20th century. But I think that there's this philosophical issue. I'm not a philosopher. I don't pretend to be. I don't play one on television. It's like, but if you look at the development of the bourgeois democratic process, the process of introduction of capitalism, one of the things that's fascinating is the level of philosophical discussions that were underway in order to create a framework for the introduction of this new social system and economic system. And I think that we need to move that. I think that that kind of philosophical underpinning of our movement is very important. And it relates to what I was saying before about ideas, that ideas do motivate people and that people are looking for something to believe in, and particularly in this era of despair and nihilism. So I'll leave it at that, Tim.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to go now to the voting rights question, and I'm actually going to invite our DSA comrades, but also you, Matt Nelson, because I know that the work that Presente.org has been doing specifically around this. So I'm going to ask Kristian, David, and Matt to react and reflect on the question that we heard around voting rights in this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I had mentioned it earlier, but maybe, that was sort of missed in the sense, but, I did help co-author a resolution around voting rights and the formation of a voting rights committee in particular within DSA, because we did feel like that was the scope of work that we didn't want to just sort of relegate to, formations that have largely, been both unable to protect our current wins and obviously are being targeted and often playing the defensive, which I think is super damaging to our basic democratic rights. But also, if you're constantly playing the defensive, it's really hard to come in and be proactive and push for what the horizon of mass democracy looks like. Moving beyond, are we going for automatic voter registration to, who can vote, incarcerated people, undocumented people, really moving that needle beyond sort of, I think what voting rights has sometimes been relegated to, which is just like, oh, well, let's just keep doing voter registration efforts over and over again, and really sort of not talking about the necessity to both clarify the class dynamics of the way voter suppression is largely worked, and in particular for DSA, knowing that so many folks that are targeted by for voter suppression are underrepresented in the organization. And I actually attribute a lot of sort of this mindset of the necessity of this project to a reading group that Bill and Jose La Luz, who's now also on the National Political Committee, and being able to really, again, really talk about democracy in a practical way, I think is super important. The other part, I know this is like the second question, but we actually do have a Green New Deal for Public Schools campaign currently being carried out by a lot of our chapters are super excited and have plenty of opportunities to get involved. And I will drop a link in the chat where, we're really pushing for a huge investment in our infrastructure, in union jobs and green jobs, and in particular, acknowledging the role that public schools play, both in our communities, but obviously, with the most, I think, unvaccinated segment of the working class, which are children, for obvious reasons. So super important, definitely make sure to check it out and click on that link, because I'm sure there's ways to get involved for folks on the call.
So I have just two comments. One is in the same vein that DSA is not the left. I want DSA to do much more on voting rights, and one of the reasons I rejoined Social Majority was because of people like Kristian's commitment to that. But it has to be a bigger struggle. Like if DSA does something or doesn't do something, it's important, but it's not as important as like that a lot of other people I think are failing at this critical moment. And it's really a very deeply concerning to me. And I think it's something we can we should think about that broadly. Like I think about it's adjacent, like the filibuster that still exists, and it's despite tremendous popular support to overturn it. And that DSA can't overturn that. You need popular forces to do that in the same way to defend voting rights. And on the environment, I think it's been fascinating for me to see, as someone who's been in DSA for 15 years, how DSA used to basically never talk about the environment. At our 2017 convention, which is like the new DSA gets launched, like eco-socialism doesn't make the cut for the agenda. And now we have 3 people elected on a Green New Deal slate to the national leadership in addition to all. And it was, resoundingly popular to focus on that. So I think if people are recognizing the climate crisis in DSA, and it's becoming much more central to our work than it was even 4 years ago, much less forgetting how it used to be. So I'll hand it to Matt.
I mean, the promise of protecting voting rights, in my mind, is the promise of governance and shared governance. And I see us in this position, for instance, in California, where the left is now being asked to save Governor Gavin Newsom's ass from recall. And I think we're going to be asked the same thing, is to save President Biden's ass in 2022, to save the House of Representatives majority and the Senate slim majority in 2022. So we're going to be asked either like in private or explicitly by Democrats in power to please save their ass. And that basically was what we were asked to do in the 2020 election, like save us from more years of the Trumpocalypse. And then the question, which is a strategic question, is what do we get in return? Where is that negotiation? What are we exacting? How are we being closer to governance or relating to governance, knowing that it was in many ways the left? It was particularly like Black and brown people in urban centers who delivered the presidency for Biden-Harris. And if Gavin Newsom wins the recall, it's going to be progressives who deliver that for him in California in a couple weeks. And same with like 2022. It is an uphill battle. Democrats are in trouble in terms of 2022 elections with the redistricting and with all the other like shenanigans happening. They're in deep, deep trouble. And they haven't asked yet explicitly, but they will be asking for help. And I think it's got to come with the strategy. It's got to come with a power shift that we haven't seen yet. I'll put in the chat too the project that Sarin, Kira, and I, and probably a number of other people from the call worked on the last is a book around turnout, but I think the cohort, the formation, the group of people we put together with that book are the ones who I'm still going to go to in terms of helping us figure out what is the real win in 2022. I do think that like this question about demographics and destiny is always a tension that we need to understand. And I also think that does relate to, what we talked about before about how big should our movements be? I think about the like 60 million Latinx folks, in the country. How many of those folks should we be organizing in order to like actually make the difference that we need to make? On the climate crisis, again, you can't address it without addressing white supremacy and racial justice and immigration and health justice. Like it's no more. And just to give you an example about how some of these things are changing is that we were just admitted to be an observer at the COP26, and usually they would just see our name and like throw it away. But it was because there were very few people who were understanding the climate crisis in terms of migration and global migration and like US people of color populations. That's the only reason why we were admitted as having observer status. But it's significant. It's significant on its face, but it's then also as powerful as we can make it and leverage it. I think that's where, just a lot of this conversation about how, and I heard the comment is like, we grew so fast or we're this big now and we don't know exactly how to figure it out. But that to me speaks to like, we need to be having more conversations preparing for victory. We need to be having more conversations knowing that it's coming, knowing in the surfer analogy, these waves are coming. And are we ready? We're really good at preparing for failure and defeat. We're really good at like thinking about crises. We're not as good as preparing for victory, as preparing for what that would look like, when we win.
I'm going to jump in quickly on the climate question, since David asked me to. It was, in terms of this, again, it's the climate is this big thing that's going to like shift everything in the conjuncture, right? Not just with the pandemic. I mean, I live here in Northern California where there's 4 fires, mega fires, wildfires burning within 100 miles of me. A lot of this has to do, and just the one point I want to throw in that hasn't been said before, is really to look to Indigenous struggle, and not just in a superficial way. So, I mean, somebody talked about, base areas aren't really possible anymore. Standing Rock and Line 3, camps have been base areas on sovereign tribal lands, right? That aren't technically supposed to be part of the United States, but are these spaces where, Native and non-Native people alike can come and share ideas and like think about strategies for struggle. I think a big fact that a lot of people tend to miss and don't recognize nearly seriously enough is that, there's 573 sovereign, legally recognized nations on this continent. It's not one country. There are 573 other countries here with legal authority and but ones that need to be enforced and be supported by the larger community. Working in environmental activism with tribes and in stewardship, trying to get stewardship agreements, is that land back, right? Land back is a real thing. And I mean, it's not just like a pie in the sky thing. It's about asserting their political control over not just reservation areas, but ancestral territories that affect us all. And so, and everywhere you are is native land. Everywhere you are, there is a tribe whose political control, and, look to see what's happening in your area. There are hundreds of tribes that are really pushing forward with an environmental perspective and environmental stewardship, and have the sovereignty to be able to affect solutions that may not be, considered, or even thought of in a U.S. government context. So So yeah, that's sort of my always soapbox on these climate questions, is that the original people of this place not only have the moral authority, but also legal and political authority, and that but it can't be asserted without our support of non-native communities in solidarity with their struggles.
Thank you all. Like this has been a rich conversation. The time has flown by. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to lift up from Rachel Patton, a DSA member, but also ask everyone on the panel for final remarks. Then Joe, I'm going to turn it to you to make sure that everybody knows about the upcoming Shelter in Solidarity offerings that are coming up. So we'll do I'll read the question, and then we'll go Kristian, David Duhalde, Bill Fletcher, Matt Nelson, Mel, then myself, again, reacting to Rachel's question and any final thoughts. So Rachel asked, Resolution 5, which was building worker power through the DSA Labor Commission, passed at this convention. How do you see all DSA contributing positively to the labor movement going forward? So Kristian, you can react to that if you like, but also we'll hear final thoughts. Kristian.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm reacting and also final thoughts at the same time, right? Okay, great. Just want to make sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think right now what we're seeing in real time is DSA chapters, for instance, supporting Nabisco workers in every area that, you know, they've gone on strike. We have a chapter in Portland, we have a chapter in Chicago, we have a chapter in Colorado, we have a chapter in Richmond, which is really great to be able to, I mean, I think we were talking earlier about the ability to be able to mobilize and really move people into the action that's necessary to support, you know, this everyday work that, you know, people don't really see. You don't really, you know, post on Twitter, hey, we're forming a union, or hey, we're thinking of going on strike. But being able to really be there to both support striking workers, but also be able to do that as DSA in a very visible way, I think is super important. And it has not just been the only instance. We saw that with UAW workers, for instance. We did that in North Texas, with the Arlington plant being the largest one in the country, which again, all of these are just super important. And I think ways that our chapters have seen that they can both support members of their local community, particularly workers, but also being very clear about the dynamics of oppression that comes with labor, that comes with profit, and also doing that as DSA, I think is super important. And we have seen, you know, people join DSA through that, but also building these really long-term, deep relationships with local labor unions, with local councils that I think then allow us to continue and catapult the work going forward. So that I'm sure David has more, but I'll leave it at that for now. And I think, you know, for me, some final thoughts, obviously, you know, it's a little intimidating being in, you know, national leadership of an organization that, you know, is huge by a lot of standards, but also, you know, is facing some both uncharted territory, and also, like, you know, I don't think when I was elected, you know, 2 years ago, I ever saw us, you know, carrying out this work in the midst of a pandemic, really rethinking what it means to organize, when so many of the beautiful things about coming together have been really, you know, made somewhat impossible due to the pandemic, and trying to figure out how to, you know, continue to bridge human connection through virtual means is definitely wearing on our spirit and on our ability to, like, not fall to despair. But I think at the end of the day, for me, you know, I've been organizing for a little less than a decade, which is definitely not as long as a lot of folks here on this call, which is great, because I also think that we need to make a lot of efforts to make sure our spaces are multi-generational, are multilingual, and multiracial, of course. And so I always appreciate learning from more experienced comrades how to stay committed to the fight. Because, you know, we are a volunteer organization, so at any point folks could just say, you know what, I'm out, and some folks do, but I think a lot of folks, myself included, think about leaving, get frustrated, but stay, because we are committed to, building a socialist vision, to reminding the working class that we can fight for a world that we deserve everything, and that we're able to come together only through collective action. So I will make my DSA plug. If you're not a member of DSA, definitely encourage you to join at dsausa.org/join, because I do think it is, in this moment, you cannot be a socialist alone, and it's super important to be a part of a political organization that's committed to being an alternative to all the bullshit that we see in the world right now. So I think I will leave it at that.
Great. Thanks, Kristian. It's hard to follow. So first, I want to thank Shelter in Solidarity for having me back again. It's an honor to always get to speak to folks here. On Resolution 5, the labor, I think one thing that's been excited for me about that being a consensus resolution was that at the last convention, people were kind of putting together like ostensibly competing labor visions that were really complementary, because you're going to need multiple strategies to engage the labor movement. It's not just a rank and file strategy of like trying to get people to join unions in certain sectors, or it's not just like getting people to work for unions, and not just trying to organize the unorganized. It's all of those. And what I've been most excited about DSA recently is the work around the PRO Act, which is the federal legislation to make it easier to organize and to make it harder to fight unions. And DSA did really incredible work in almost doing 1 million calls, really helping shift some, putting targeted calls that really helped shift Angus King and Joe Manchin. And the victory is not there yet, but I think that President Biden has talked about putting some parts of the PRO Act in some of the budget and infrastructure bills, which is much further than Barack Obama went. And I think that's not just because of DSA, obviously, but I think reflects like a more dynamic labor movement and more of a sense of like, we need to work together. And that's a healthy sign, I think, for DSA to want to be part of a coalition with other unions to advance labor strategy, not just pushing things by itself, though it's really critical. What people mentioned, doing solidarity with the nurses at St. Vincent's or my mom's hometown in Worcester, to the Nabisco workers. And this might conclude remarks. I'm just going to kind of echo again. Bill and I were on a great panel with Maria Savart, the national director, and Beth Fong from Boston DSA, someone I helped recruit to DSA, who's amazing, who does voting rights work. And we talked about how DSA was once very small, and I think it gets small again. These things happen in waves, and it's really up to us to be vigilant. Most people in DSA have joined and only seen a DSA that's growing like exponentially. That's not guaranteed. And it's really vigilant that people join. Kristian already gave the plug, but also people join other civic society organizations and really try to build a coalition politics. I think that's really going to be critical to beating back the far right. We've talked a lot about other problems, but I really want to bring it back to what Bill said and others say too, because ultimately central to my politics is that, if we don't defeat the far right, it doesn't really matter. Because, if they're running things, our differences aren't that big. So I'll stop there, but I really just want to appreciate everyone. It's really been a great panel, and especially the audience asking such wonderful questions.
Bill?
So I want to thank Shelter and Solidarity for inviting me. I'm not going to talk about labor, because if I did, which is what I talk about most of the time, it would just go on much too long. So I'm going to jump to my final comments. I want to remind people about the nature of the moment that we're in. This is not a Tweedledee Tweedledum moment we're in with the Democrats and the Republicans. We are, for the first time in our lives, I would argue, dealing with a Republican Party which has announced itself to be a party for dictatorship. They're not beating the bushes anymore, beating around the bush anymore. They are very explicit that they are going to do whatever they need to do. Now, this puts us in a situation where There are forces in the Democratic Party and elsewhere with which we do not have much agreement. But the question is, do we want to fight alongside them against a common opponent? Or do we think that we can fight against them simultaneously? Now, one of the things that I learned when I was a kid in the Bronx is that you only take on one enemy at a time, or at least the number of enemies that you can throw down at one moment, because you do not want to be overwhelmed by opponents. So we have a very immediate task of taking on the Neo-Confederacy. And that's going to mean that there's going to be some uncomfortable alliances. It also means that there are going to be people in the Democratic Party that we can simply not stand, but we're going to have to work with if we want to defeat the Neo-Confederacy. Because I think January 6th should have told us something. One, that we had a president that was prepared to endorse, if not organize, a coup attempt, that there was a significant section of the Republican Party that was prepared to go along with that. And that if they won, they'd probably annihilate us, or at least attempt to. I think that we need to take that very seriously. And I realize that that's going to mean for many of us on the left who have been so pure and have relished in our purity, that things are going to get complicated. I'd rather complicated than a concentration camp. So I'm going to leave it at that. And again, thank you all.
Matt and Mel.
Yeah, hi everybody. Definitely echo the thanks and the practice of solidarity. I do think that this is a good practice in understanding how we regather and how we do the type of organizing we need to do. So I'm glad that we're putting it into practice tonight. Yeah, I think these are incredible times, and we see it so much with labor. I think the fact that there are that people are leaving jobs at unprecedented numbers, that people are demanding more from employers, that people have really been, the labor market has been shaken to the core. And I do think that in many ways, everyday workers understand, especially in industries like the restaurant industry, and, understand their power. And also just this heightened contradiction around essential workers and what that means to be essential and what that means to be valued. And so there is a lot of people waking up to the fact that they have power, that they have more power than they ever realized in their workplace. And I think it's our duty to organize with them and to leverage that power, realize that power, because what we're also seeing is a change of, that speaks to me as a change of culture. And culture is a very, very powerful phenomenon that I think we're in that realm. We're in the realm of cultural shift here. And it's our duty to make that happen for the people. Yeah, and I guess I think it's just re-examining each one of ourselves individually too, like our own roles. And I told my team today, I was like, my job is to help support you being your best selves while doing your best work. And that's kind of how I see my role as a piece of this, as honored to be part of this movement, understanding that the movement doesn't need Matt Nelson, the movement doesn't need Presente.org, but we are, we're honored to be a steward, that we're honored to play a part in this, and do what we need to do to get free.
Okay, so on the question of labor, I actually just finished a paper, research paper on the effects of COVID on housing and labor. And, this is, I think, not something that has been really widely reported, that, the gigification or the Uberization of labor, and that shift towards like contingent independent contracting, no security of job, no benefits, is now over a third of the labor force in general. So COVID and the pandemic has really precipitated a shift in the wider labor market towards the gig economy and that kind of insecurity of work. And this is the class war from above, and impositions on the labor market. It's kind of like a disaster capitalism move on labor that I think is putting us in a position not unlike the 30s, where as these conditions are changing, we not only have to support existing organized labor, but organize all of these other sectors of people who are suffering and people who need to fight for these protections, living wages, and security. We see this in Uber and Lyft drivers organizing, fast food workers organizing. These are struggles that are going to hit all of us eventually. And so, no matter what kind of work that we do. So I do think that, but at the same time, as Matt mentioned, there are people who are just leaving wage work in droves because, it's just not delivering anymore. And so this is really a really interesting moment to have like a conversation about what the nature of work is and maybe should be, and struggles that not only seek to claw back the hard-won gains of the labor movement over the last century, but also it can envision a transformative future where our labor isn't just thrown away to the profits of the capitalists, but towards a just and sustainable and livable future for us all. And so for that, I'm going to throw the question back to David and for some last thoughts. So.
Thank you. So I'm going to make two very quick points. One, in my capacity as co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, and also one of the co-founders of a cooperation Humboldt, which is one of the myriad cooperation entities sort of springing up. And this is really to Kristian and David Duhalde to genuinely say, like, we're convening and have convened resist and build gatherings, and we've reached out to DSA working groups, and it's no shade, but like, help me get DSA, relate to DSA as the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. We really want your engagement, and we want to relate to you properly. And I hope that you can tell that this is sincere. I'm not just blowing sunshine up your ass. The reality is it is the single largest socialist formation in the country. I'm trying to relate to it comradely and productively in that sort of Fletcher, like Fletcher's Tecumseh piece, right? Like I'm trying to do that. So help me get connected. And here's my big final thought. My read of this conjuncture is that this moment is an ecological crisis that's not coming. It's here, getting worse. We're representing welcoming climate refugees into Humboldt County right now, more to come. Secondly, there is an economic crisis known as late stage capitalism, because even if capitalism is not only existentially destroying the planet faster than she can replenish herself, right? But with robotics, automation, and technology, the old way of political economy and the capitalist just extracting the surplus value of labor for profit means that doesn't work anymore. It's not just a proletariat, it's a precariat, right? There's not even enough work for people to do in order to get the money to buy the things. And those two crises, the ecological and economic crisis, is literally creating the existential political crisis, which is fascism. And that's because the political system can't solve the problems. To be clear, this political system was never designed to solve the problem of white supremacy or heteropatriarchy or settler colonialism or healthcare or any of the things that we care about. I'm saying something different. This political system can't even do what it was designed to do, which is maintain fucking order for the bourgeois class. I believe sincerely and genuinely, we are at that moment where in the next decade, we're either going to win everything or nothing. Like, to paraphrase Comrade Rosa Luxemburg, it's either eco-socialism or fascism. Like, the neoliberal center is collapsing as we see it. And I believe our program and project needs to actually be rooted in meeting people's needs right here, right now, wherever you live, work, play, and pray. So I've got lots more to say, but I'll save it for another Shelter in Solidarity conversation. I'm going to turn it to Joe to tell us about some of the other exciting programs Shelter in Solidarity have coming up.
All right, thank you very much, David and Mel, the guest co-hosts of this very, I think, lively and useful and certainly timely Shelter in Solidarity conversation. Thanks also to all the guests and the contributing audience members who are not just audience members, who added their voices, at least to the chat box today. Shelter in Solidarity started over a year ago. We've done over 50 of these shows now since the pandemic hit. I think we're probably close to 60. I just want to point those who are not familiar with our platform to our website, which is shelterandsolidarity.org. Maybe one of our co-producers will add that in the chat box, since I cannot multitask at that level. And if you go to shelterandsolidarity.org, you can see the archive of all the shows we've done, which have included a number of the folks who were here today, David Duhalde, David Cobb, Bill Fletcher, and many, many others.